lantern-lit streets of Alindra stretched for miles beneath the earth, gold-veined stone towers rising toward a false sky. The man they now called the Hollow King had carved himself, and merchants from 3 surface kingdoms waited months for the privilege of trading behind walls no army above had ever managed to find. But they forget the dirt in his mouth. They forget the weight of the stone slab pressed down on his chest while he screamed into silence that no one above the ground was ever meant to hear. Because once, the same man who now ruled a city that history insisted did not exist had nothing. No name. No allies. No heir. He had been buried alive in a graveyard reserved for men the crown wanted to erase completely. And somewhere beneath that grave, in the dark, he found something that should not have still been standing after 300 years of official, absolute destruction. Tamlin Rourke had spent 9 years as chief royal architect to the kingdom of Thornwick, the man King Alaric Born trusted to restore every crumbling watchtower and reinforce every failing bridge along the crown's northern holdings. And he had believed, in the particular foolish way of men who mistake usefulness for safety, that competence purchased loyalty. He had risen from a stonemason's apprentice to the crown's most trusted builder through sheer grinding merit, a fact the older architectural guild had never forgiven him for. No matter how many collapsing structures his careful design saved, or how many workers walked home alive from projects that lesser architects had gotten killed through careless shortcuts. He learned otherwise on a wet autumn evening when 4 royal guardsmen entered his workshop without knocking and placed him in irons before he had even set down the drafting compass still in his hand. The charge was treason. The evidence was a set of forged fortification plans, discovered in a rebel encampment 200 miles south, bearing Tamlin's own precise architectural hand, a hand that had, in truth, never drawn those particular lines, though the forgery was skilled enough that even Tamlin, staring at it in the throne room 3 days later, found himself briefly uncertain of his own memory. He would learn the truth only much later, in fragments, pieced together from smuggled rumor and overheard gossip, that Lord Cassian Vey, the crown's second architect, and a man who had spent 9 years watching Tamlin receive commissions he believed should have been his own, had commissioned the forgery from a disgraced court scribe with a gambling debt too large to refuse the coin. The trial lasted less than an hour. King Alaric, exhausted and paranoid after 2 failed harvests and a rebellion he could not fully suppress, wanted a traitor's name to announce to a frightened capital more than he wanted the truth. And Cassian Vey, standing at the king's right hand with an expression of carefully rehearsed sorrow, gave him one. "Your Majesty," Cassian had said, his voice pitched perfectly to carry throughout the packed throne room, thick with a grief that did not reach his eyes. "I did not want to believe it either. Rourke and I have worked side by side for 9 years. But a man's hand does not lie, and this hand is his." Tamlin, still chained, had shouted that the plans were forged, that he had never set foot within 200 miles of the rebel encampment where they were found, that any architect in the kingdom could see the proportions were subtly wrong in a way his own trained eye would never have permitted. No one on the dais looked at the plans a second time. King Alaric had already decided, before Tamlin was even dragged into the room, exactly what verdict would let him sleep that night, and Cassian Vey's performance was simply the ceremony required to make that verdict feel earned. "Take him to the Hollow," the king said, not quite meeting Tamlin's eyes, the same way Tamlin would recall bitterly in the years that followed. A man avoids meeting the eyes of a dog he has decided to have put down. "I want no grave. No name. Let the Barrows keep him." He was sentenced not to execution, which would have made him a martyr for whatever cause the crown feared he secretly served, but to the hollow sentence, a punishment reserved for traitors the crown wished not merely dead, but erased, buried alive beneath the sundered Barrows. The ruins of the old Alindran Empire that had fallen 3 centuries earlier in a catastrophe so total that not one contemporary account agreed on its cause. No grave marker. no name in any record. A man sentenced to the hollow simply stopped existing, and the Crown's conscience, such as it was, stayed clean. They marched him to the barrows in a covered cart so that no crowd could witness the sentence carried out, which told Tamlin, even through his own numb terror, that some part of the Crown understood exactly how monstrous this punishment truly was, and preferred it done where no one could object. The ruins themselves rose out of the autumn fog like broken teeth, black stone pillars and collapsed archways, scattered across a landscape that even the local shepherds refused to graze their flocks near, and the two gravekeepers assigned to the sentence grim. Silent men who clearly performed this duty often enough to have stopped feeling anything about it, led him to a rectangular pit already dug into the collapsed foundation of what had once, judging by the crumbling scale of the ruins around it, been some grand hall of the dead empire. Tamlin did not beg. He would tell himself, in the years that followed, that this had been dignity, though he suspected, more honestly, that it had simply been shock too complete for words. He lay in the pit while the gravekeepers lowered a slab of quarried stone over the opening, sealing him into darkness so absolute it had a physical weight. And he heard, muffled through solid rock, the sound of loose earth being shoveled over the slab, burying the seal itself, so that even a man with impossible strength would find nothing to push against but packed dirt for a dozen feet in every direction. He screamed until his throat tore. He clawed at stone until his fingernails split and the blood froze against his skin in the pit's deep cold. He did not know, in those first delirious hours, how long a buried man survived before the air itself simply ran out, only that he had begun to count his own heartbeats as a way of proving to himself that time still existed, and that the counting had reached somewhere past 4,000 before exhaustion finally dragged him into a sleep he fully expected to be his last. He woke, which surprised him more than anything else that terrible day. The air had not run out. It was thin and stale, and carried a faint mineral bitterness that caught in the back of his throat. But it existed, and existing meant the pit was not as sealed as the gravekeepers believed. He spent the following hours he could not have said how many running his torn fingers along every surface within reach, mapping his prison by touch alone, until he found it, a hairline gap along the pit's northern wall, where centuries-old mortar had crumbled to something closer to sand than stone, a seam in the Empire's ancient foundation that predated his burial by 300 years, and had simply never been noticed by gravekeepers, who dug their pits with speed rather than care. He did not know, digging at that crumbling seam with hands already ruined, that he was not merely searching for an exit. He was searching for the entrance to a city. The digging took him what he later calculated, from the growth of his own beard and the cycles of exhausted sleep, to be 9 days, though time in that absolute darkness stretched and compressed in ways that made any precise count unreliable. He tore his fingers to the bone. He broke 2 of them entirely on the 4th day, forcing his hand into a gap too narrow for the width of his knuckles, and continued digging afterward with the uninjured hand alone, sobbing without tears because his body no longer had the water to spare for them. He ate nothing in those 9 days but the memory of food, and drank only the faint, foul moisture that beaded on the ancient stone in the pit's coldest hours, licking it desperately from his own fingers. On the 6th day, he nearly gave up entirely. He had cleared, by his own careful measure, perhaps 2 feet of the crumbling seam, and the passage ahead showed no sign of opening into anything but more solid stone. And some collapsing part of his mind, starved of food and water and light in equal measure, began to whisper that this was simply a slower, crueler death than suffocation would have been. That he was digging his own grave one aching handful at a time, rather than accepting the mercy of a quick end. He lay motionless against the rubble for what felt like hours, listening to his own ragged breathing. And it was the memory of Cassian Vey's rehearsed, grieving face in the throne room, not hope, not faith, but sheer stubborn refusal to let that man's lie stand as his final legacy, that finally got his ruined hands moving again. On the 9th day, the crumbling seam finally gave way entirely, and Tamlin fell forward into open space, tumbling down a slope of loose rubble into a darkness that was, for one terrifying moment, indistinguishable from the pit he had just escaped. Then he saw the light. It was faint, and it was blue, and it came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a soft, ambient glow emanating from veins of pale crystal embedded throughout the walls of a passage that curved away into the distance, wide enough for 4 men to walk abreast. Its floor paved in stone so precisely fitted that not even 3 centuries of settling earth had managed to crack it. Tamlin lay in the rubble at the passage's entrance for a long time, certain his ruined mind had finally broken entirely and begun manufacturing hallucinations to ease his own death. But the stone beneath his torn hands remained solid and cold and real, no matter how many times he pressed his palm against it, and eventually, because there was nothing else left to do, he began to crawl. He would not know it yet, but the Empire's official history, the history every scribe in Thornwick's royal archive had copied faithfully for 300 years, insisted that Elindra, the Sundered Empire's magnificent capital, had been utterly destroyed in whatever catastrophe ended its reign, its people and its wonders reduced to the broken rubble scattered across the surface above. He was crawling, in that moment, through proof that the official history was a lie. The passage opened, after what felt like another full day of crawling and stumbling through darkness, broken only by that faint crystal glow, into a cavern so vast that Tamlin's exhausted mind initially refused to process its scale. Towers of pale stone rose from a cavern floor that stretched further than his weak light could illuminate, connected by bridges of the same impossibly precise craftsmanship as the entrance passage, and above it all, carved into the cavern's distant ceiling, with a skill that made Tamlin's own considerable architectural knowledge feel like a child's first clumsy sketches, stretched a false sky, a dome inlaid with the same pale crystal, arranged to mimic, faintly and eternally, the pattern of stars no one buried this deep should ever have been able to see again. He stood at the edge of that impossible vista for a long time, swaying on legs that had carried him 9 days through solid rock, and found himself laughing a broken, hollow sound that echoed strangely off towers that had stood silent and empty for 3 centuries. He had spent his career restoring the crumbling remnants of lesser structures, patching stonework that lesser architects had botched a generation earlier. And here, in a grave meant to erase him entirely, stood proof of a mastery so far beyond his own that it made every professional accomplishment of his old life feel suddenly, painfully small. He did not know, in that first delirious moment of awe, whether he was meant to feel triumphant or simply crushed by the scale of what surrounded him. He felt, mostly, that his mind had finally truly broken, and that this glorious, impossible vision was simply the shape his own death had chosen to take. He collapsed at the threshold of that impossible city and did not wake for what he would later learn, from evidence he pieced together over the following weeks, had been nearly 2 full days. The brutal work of understanding what he had found consumed the following months, and it very nearly killed him more than once. His first, desperate priority was food and water, and he found both within the city's outer districts in forms that terrified him before they saved him vast stone cisterns, still fed by some ancient channel that drew clean water down from the surface world above through routes Tamlin never fully mapped, and storage vaults sealed with mechanisms he did not understand, containing preserved grain and dried provisions that should have rotted to dust in 3 centuries but had not, protected by some property of the crystal light itself that Tamlin could not explain, and, in his starved and desperate state, did not particularly care to interrogate. He nearly died opening the first vault. The sealing mechanism was a wheel of the same pale stone as the walls, inset with a pattern of small crystal studs that Tamlin, in his hunger-addled state, simply began pressing at random, certain that persistence alone would eventually yield results the way it always had on a stubborn construction problem. It did, but not the results he wanted. The wheel gave way all at once after 2 full days of failed attempts, and the vault released a cloud of stale, pressurized air that had been sealed inside for 300 years, knocking him backward off his feet and leaving him retching and dizzy on the cold stone floor for hours, uncertain whether he had just poisoned himself entirely with whatever ancient vapor the vault had kept trapped. He had not. But the lesson cost him 3 more days of recovery, curled shivering on the cavern floor and fighting off a headache so violent it blurred his vision. Before he trusted himself to attempt a second vault, this time working the wheel slowly, in careful quarter turns, venting the trapped air in small increments and retreating a safe distance after each one, rather than forcing it open all at once the way impatience had nearly cost him his life the first time. The food, when he finally reached it safely, was strange dense, faintly sweet cakes of some grain Tamlin did not recognize. Preserved through means he could not identify, and eating too much too quickly on a stomach that had gone 9 days without real sustenance left him violently ill for the better part of a night. Another hard lesson paid for in suffering before his body finally adjusted to small, careful portions. A single cake broken into quarters and eaten across the better part of a day, rather than devoured all at once. It was in his 3rd week alone in the city, a period he spent in a state of near constant low terror, jumping at every echo, certain some ancient guardian or trap would kill him for trespassing, in a place clearly not meant for the living that Tamlin found the journal. It lay in a small chamber near the city's central plaza, tucked inside a leather satchel that had survived remarkably well in the crystal-lit air, beside the skeletal remains of a man who had, judging by the tattered remnants of his clothing, been a prisoner much like Tamlin himself. The journal's pages, brittle but legible, told a story that made Tamlin's already unsteady sense of reality crack further. The dead man's name had been Halvard Koss, buried beneath the barrows some 40 years earlier for the crime of desertion, and he had found this same city, this same impossible survival, and had lived within its walls for nearly 6 years before some illness the journal described only vaguely finally killed him. Halvard's careful, obsessive notes, clearly the work of a mind that had turned to documentation as the only defense against the crushing isolation of his situation, mapped districts Tamlin had not yet explored, catalogued which of the ancient vaults held food, and which held only strange, inert machinery he had never managed to understand, and described, in an entry near the journal's end, a discovery that made Tamlin's breath catch. A second passage, deeper in the city's structure, that led, through a difficult and dangerous climb, back up toward the surface world, emerging somewhere within the sundered barrows themselves. Halvard had never used it. His final entries described a growing illness that had left him too weak to attempt the climb, and the journal ended, mid-sentence, in a way that told Tamlin exactly how the old deserter's story had concluded. One entry, dated by Halvard's own careful count some 3 years into his solitary exile, lingered in Tamlin's mind longer than the others. The old deserter had written, in a hand grown shaky with what Tamlin suspected was the illness that would eventually kill him, that he had come to believe the city was not entirely dead, that something in its deepest, unlit districts answered, however faintly, to a man's presence, and that he had begun to feel, in his loneliest hours, less like a trespasser in a tomb, and more like a guest waiting, patiently, to be properly received. Halvard had never explained what he meant by this. He simply noted it, once, and moved on to more practical matters of food and water, as though the observation itself had frightened him too much to dwell on further. Tamlin would carry that single unexplained entry with him for the rest of his years in the city, returning to it every time his own scouts brought reports of sounds and lights in the districts no one had yet dared fully explore. Tamlin sat with that journal for a long time, grieving a stranger he had never met, and understood, reading Halvard's careful, lonely handwriting. That he had just been handed something the dead man never had enough surviving strength, and enough of a head start, to actually use what this city offered, rather than simply dying quietly within its walls as its most recent, temporary guest. He spent the following 2 months in careful, methodical exploration, following Halvard's maps and expanding on them, learning the city's layout and its dangers with the same patient discipline he had once brought to studying a crumbling watchtower before deciding how to reinforce it. He learned that certain districts, closer to the cavern's deep, unlit edges, carried an oppressive wrongness he could not fully articulate, a sense of being watched that made him retreat every time he ventured too close, and he learned, through the careful, frightened trial of testing smaller mechanisms before attempting larger ones, the basic principles of the crystal light that powered the city's illumination, that it responded, faintly, to touch and intention in ways no ordinary stone should, brightening subtly when he worked near it with focus and purpose, dimming when his own fear and exhaustion grew too great. He tested this observation deliberately on several occasions, forcing himself to remain calm and deliberate even when exhaustion made calm feel impossible, and confirmed, to his own growing unease, that the correlation held every single time that the light itself seemed, in some fashion he could not begin to explain through any principle of architecture or engineering he had ever studied, to be paying attention to him. The breakthrough that changed everything came in his 4th month, when Tamlin, following Halvard's map toward a district the old deserter's notes described only as the Forge Quarter, found a workshop that had clearly once belonged to some master craftsman of the fallen Empire tools of a strange lightweight metal Tamlin did not recognize. Arranged with the particular order of a workspace its owner had expected to return to, and, more importantly, partially completed mechanisms scattered across 3 long stone benches, their purpose entirely unclear to him at first glance. He spent the following weeks simply cataloging what he found, the same disciplined patience he had once brought to surveying a crumbling watchtower, now turned toward objects whose function he could only guess at. Some of the mechanisms, when he finally worked up the nerve to test them, did nothing at all, inert regardless of how he touched or turned them. One, tested on his 11th attempt, released a sudden burst of concentrated heat that seared a line across his forearm before he could drop it, leaving a scar that would ache faintly in cold weather for the rest of his life. Another, tested 2 weeks later, with considerably more caution learned from the first mistake, simply crumbled to gray dust in his hands. Whatever ancient property had once animated it long since exhausted by 3 centuries of dormancy. It was the 12th device, a small, palm-sized construct of the strange lightweight metal inlaid with a sliver of the same crystal that lit the city's walls, that finally worked as Tamlin had begun to suspect these mechanisms were meant to. He held it near a section of glowing wall, focusing his attention on it the way he might focus on solving a stubborn structural problem, and felt, more than saw, the device draw a thread of that ambient light into itself, the crystal sliver at its heart brightening steadily, until the whole object glowed with a soft, portable version of the city's own illumination. He nearly dropped it from sheer startled disbelief. He sat instead, alone in that ancient workshop, turning the small glowing device over and over in his scarred hands for the better part of an hour, understanding, with a clarity that made his chest ache, exactly what he had just proven, that the crystal light was not merely decorative, not merely ambient, but a resource that could be drawn, shaped, and carried, once a man understood how to ask it properly. He spent another full month refining that understanding, testing variations of the device's design with materials salvaged from elsewhere in the Forge Quarter, failing far more often than he succeeded, burning his palms twice more and losing an entire week to a mechanism that, tested incorrectly, filled the workshop with a bitter smoke that left him coughing and half blind, until he managed to stumble clear of it. But each failure taught him something the last one hadn't, and by the month's end he had produced not just a single working device, but a small, reliable batch of them. Along with a rougher understanding of a second mechanism, one working example, he finally coaxed back to function. After a dozen failed attempts that left him with minor burns and one badly singed eyebrow that revealed itself to be a kind of controlled preservation field, identical in effect to the one that had kept the food vaults intact for 3 centuries. He understood, holding that final working device in his scarred hands, that he was no longer simply surviving in a dead city's ruins. He was standing on the edge of a fortune that no surface kingdom had ever imagined existed. The first outsider came, as Tamlin had begun to fear he eventually would. Not through any door he controlled, but through the same crumbling seam he had once clawed his own way through. It was in his 8th month underground that Tamlin, working near the passage that connected his pit to the greater city, heard the unmistakable sound of digging from the other side of the collapsed wall. Another prisoner, buried in a pit adjacent to his own, clawing at the same weak seam in the Empire's ancient foundation that Halvard's note suggested had claimed more than one desperate victim over the centuries. Tamlin worked from his side to widen the gap, and within an hour, a young woman named Sarah Voss tumbled through into the crystal-lit passage, half mad with the same terror and disbelief that had once nearly broken Tamlin's own mind entirely. Sarah had been sentenced to the Hollow for stealing bread from a merchant's stall to feed a younger brother who had, she told Tamlin later, in a voice still raw from days of screaming into her own sealed pit, likely starved to death in the weeks since her burial regardless of her sacrifice. She was 17, sharp-eyed even in her exhaustion, and it took Tamlin the better part of a week to convince her that the crystal-lit city surrounding them was not some final delirious hallucination before the last of her sanity gave out. "You're lying," she told him flatly, on the 3rd day, backed against a wall of pale glowing stone with a broken shard of rock gripped in her fist like a knife. "This is what happens. The air runs out and you start seeing things, and then you're dead, and I'm not going to die trusting a stranger's lies." "Look at your hands," Tamlin said quietly, not moving closer. "Are they bleeding from digging through stone, or are they clean?" A dream doesn't leave calluses. She had looked down at her torn, filthy palms for a long moment, and something in her sharp, frightened eyes had finally cracked. When she finally believed him, she did not weep with relief. She laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound, and asked him, with the particular directness of someone who had survived on the streets long enough to distrust anything offered freely, what exactly he intended to do with a dead Empire's fortune now that he had found it. Tamlin did not have a full answer yet, but Sarah's question, blunt and practical, crystallized something that had been forming slowly in his own mind through 8 months of solitary exploration, that a city this vast, this rich in resources no surface kingdom possessed, was worth nothing at all if it remained simply a tomb for 2 frightened survivors to hide within forever. The first real trade came 6 months later, and it very nearly ended in disaster before it ended in triumph. Tamlin and Sarah had by then mapped a second surface passage beyond the one Halvard's journal described, a narrow crevice emerging within a stretch of the barrows far from the gravekeeper's usual burial sites. And Sarah, with the particular fearlessness of a girl who had already survived being buried alive and found it somehow less terrifying than what waited beneath, volunteered to make the first cautious surface excursion. She returned 4 days later, with a black market fence named Orin Thale, a wiry, nervous man who ran contraband through the barrows surrounding villages, and who Sarah had judged, correctly, to be exactly desperate and exactly unscrupulous enough to deal with 2 escaped Hollow prisoners without immediately reporting them to the Crown. Orin's first reaction to the crystal light device Tamlin offered him was suspicion bordering on outright fear. No honest trader carries goods this strange without a very good explanation, Orin said, turning the small device over in his hands without quite bringing himself to touch its faintly glowing core directly. Strange goods from strange sources have a way of getting a man executed alongside whoever sold them to him. Where does this come from, truly? You don't want the true answer, Tamlin said. You want to know it's safe to sell, and that no one will trace it back to your throat. I can promise you both. What I represent is a small community of scholars and craftsmen who found a means of drawing light and warmth from certain rare deep earth minerals, further south than any trader bothers to dig. We are not interested in a single sale. We are interested in a long-term, discrete arrangement tools, food, information about the world above, in exchange for goods unlike anything you can source elsewhere. Orin haggled hard after that, testing Tamlin's patience and his prices in equal measure, twice threatening to walk away entirely when Tamlin refused to reveal more about the goods' true origin. Once even drawing a knife he clearly had no real intention of using, purely to see whether the offer would fold under pressure. It did not. The crystal light devices sold, quietly and for extraordinary sums, to buyers in 3 different border towns within a month, and Orin returned to the barrows considerably more interested in a standing arrangement than his initial suspicion had suggested. The tools and supplies he brought back on that second visit, proper cold weather gear, medicine, and crucially, iron and steel that Tamlin's growing understanding of the city's forge quarter mechanisms let him work into instruments considerably more useful than the strange brittle metal the ancient craftsman had originally favored, became the foundation of everything that followed. Word of a reclusive trader, dealing in impossible goods, traveled slowly through the region's smuggling networks over the following 2 years. And Tamlin began, deliberately, using Sarah's surface contacts to seek out others who shared their particular, unlikely qualification for entry into the hidden city men and women who had been sentenced to the Hollow and left to die in the barrows as scattered. Burial pits, some of whom, like Tamlin and Sarah, had found their own way to the crumbling seams that connected pit to passage, and some of whom Tamlin, once he understood the pattern well enough, began deliberately locating and rescuing before their air ran out entirely. The first of these deliberate rescues was Perrin Dask, a locksmith sentenced to the Hollow for a debt to a nobleman disguised, through the man's political connections, as a charge of theft. Perrin had been buried for 11 days by the time Tamlin, working from careful observation of the gravekeeper's patterns and Sarah's surface reconnaissance, located his pit and broke through to it from the city's side rather than waiting for the prisoner to find his own way out. When Tamlin's torchlight finally broke through the last inch of packed earth, Perrin, half dead and delirious, had raised a trembling hand to shield his eyes and whispered, in a voice barely audible, that he must already be dead, because nothing living came bearing light in a place like this. It took Tamlin the better part of an hour, speaking low and steady the way he once calmed frightened apprentices on dangerous scaffolding, to convince the locksmith otherwise. Perrin would spend the rest of his life insisting that he owed Tamlin a debt no amount of skilled locksmithing could ever fully repay. And he proved, once recovered, invaluable in a way that went well beyond gratitude. His locksmith's expertise let him crack sealed vaults and mechanisms throughout the city that Tamlin's own architectural knowledge alone could never have managed, unlocking entire districts of the ancient capital that had remained closed even to Halvard's decades of prior exploration. Bramkel came a full year later, found not through Tamlin's rescue network but by his own stubborn effort, clawing through a crumbling seam much like the one Tamlin himself had once found. And he arrived in the city's outer district, already half convinced he had earned nothing but another cell to die in. He had deserted his post rather than burn a surrendering village on a commanding officer's order, and when Bram finally understood that the strange lantern-lit ruins around him represented not another prison but an actual chance at a life, he asked Tamlin only one question before offering his service: whether this settlement, whatever it was, would ever ask him to follow an order he knew to be wrong. Tamlin told him no man would ever again give him such an order here, and Bram, satisfied, spent every year after that proving the promise had been worth keeping, drilling the settlement's growing population in the discipline that would one day save all of their lives. Mother Yu arrived by a different road entirely, brought in not as a fresh prisoner, but as an old woman already near death when Sarah's surface contacts found her. Condemned as a witch by a superstitious village magistrate for the crime of successfully treating illnesses the local priest's prayers had failed to cure, and left to die of exposure in the barrows rather than granted even the dignity of a proper burial pit. Tamlin nearly lost her twice in the first week of her recovery, and it was, with grim and quiet irony, her own hard-won knowledge of herbs and remedies, combined with certain properties of the city's own crystal-infused water that Tamlin had by then learned to identify, that ultimately saved her own life alongside the countless lives she went on to save among the growing underground population in the years that followed. Tamlin built his settlement's first true governing structure in its third year, formalizing what had begun as simple, desperate cooperation into something resembling genuine community, shared labor, shared resources. A rough but functioning system of decision-making that Perrin, with his locksmith's practical mind, helped design. And that Bram, with his soldiers' understanding of discipline and fairness, helped enforce. Tamlin insisted, from the very beginning, on a principle that had crystallized in him during his own worst months of solitary terror: that no one within the city's walls would ever again be made to feel as disposable as the crown that buried him alive had made him feel. That every hand who worked the Forge Quarter or explored a new district held genuine ownership over what they built together. The first real threat came in the settlement's fourth year, and it arrived, disastrously, from within. A recent arrival named Corwin Ash, rescued by Tamlin's rescue efforts only 2 months earlier, proved to have accepted his salvation with considerably less gratitude than Perrin or the others had shown. Corwin had been a minor smuggler before his own sentencing, and he saw, in the growing trade Tamlin had established with Orenthal's network, an opportunity to enrich himself considerably beyond his fair share. He began, quietly, diverting crystal light devices meant for the settlement's authorized trade into a separate, unauthorized channel, selling them to a rival fence who paid considerably more and asked considerably fewer questions about their origin. The unauthorized sales might have gone unnoticed for months longer, if not for Sarah's sharp eye and her careful tracking of the settlement's inventory, a discipline she had insisted on establishing after watching Tamlin's early record-keeping prove hopelessly inadequate to the growing scale of their operation. When she confronted Corwin with the discrepancy, he did not deny it. "I owe the crown nothing," he said, jaw tight, refusing to look away from either Sarah or Tamlin as the small council gathered. "And I owe this place even less. You built something out of a dead man's ruins and decided that made you king of it. I dug myself out of a hole with my bare hands the same as the rest of you. Whatever's down here belongs to whoever's clever enough to take it. That's not betrayal. That's the only law that's ever actually applied to men like us." "The devices you sold," Sarah said, voice flat and cold, "were traded to my own family's grain merchant, who nearly died of a burn he can't explain to a healer he can't trust. You didn't just steal from a common store. You put every soul down here at risk, because a stranger paid you more than your fair share was worth." Corwin had no answer for that. He only looked away, at last, at the stone floor beneath his boots. Tamlin's decision, in the tense council that followed, tested the settlement's fragile unity more severely than any external threat yet had. Bram argued for expulsion, forcing Corwin back to the surface to face whatever consequences the Crown's justice might still hold for an escaped hollow prisoner. Perrin, remembering his own desperate rescue, argued for leniency, a chance to make restitution through labor rather than banishment to near certain death. Tamlin chose a middle path that satisfied no one entirely. Corwin would remain, stripped of any role involving the settlement's trade or resources, working instead under Bram's direct supervision in the Forge Quarter's most physically demanding labor. His freedom of movement within the city restricted until trust, if it ever returned at all, was rebuilt through years rather than words. The decision held, tensely, for nearly a year, until the unauthorized rival fence Corwin had once dealt with, growing greedy and careless, began asking too many questions in the wrong taverns about where such impossible goods truly originated, questions that eventually reached the ears of a royal informant, and from the informant climbed slowly over the following months toward the attention of the crown's second architect, Lord Cassian Vey, now risen to Chancellor, a man who recognized, upon hearing rumors of impossible crystal light devices traded near the sundered barrows, exactly whose skilled hand such craftsmanship might plausibly bear. Cassian Vey did not believe, at first, that Tamlin Rorca could possibly still be alive. The hollow sentence simply did not permit survival. Every gravekeeper's report across 3 centuries confirmed as much. But the Chancellor had not risen to his position through carelessness, and he dispatched, quietly and without royal authorization that might have raised uncomfortable questions about why a Chancellor concerned himself personally with rumors from a cursed graveyard. A company of the Crown's Silent Blades specialized enforcers, trained specifically to investigate and eliminate any breach of the hollow sentence's absolute secrecy to the barrows, to determine, once and for all, whether the impossible rumors held any truth. Bram's scouts spotted the Silent Blades approach 3 days before they reached the outer edges of the barrows, giving Tamlin precious time to prepare a defense for a settlement that had, in 6 years of careful growth, never once faced an enemy remotely this disciplined or this well-informed about its target. He gathered his people in the city's central plaza that first night and told them, plainly, exactly what approached and exactly what it might cost to defend what they had built. He offered any who wished to flee deeper into the city's unexplored, still frightening depths the chance to do so, understanding, as he made the offer, that he was reliving in some fashion his own long-ago moment of terrified uncertainty in a freshly dug pit, deciding whether continued survival was worth its price. Not one person chose to hide. Perrin, in his quiet, practical way, simply asked what needed securing before the enforcers arrived. And that question set the tone for the tense days that followed. The Silent Blades, when they finally located the surface passage guided, Tamlin would later learn through a captured enforcer's grim confession, by the same greedy rival fence whose loose talk had started this entire crisis, descended into the city's outer districts, expecting, per their training, to eliminate a small handful of escaped prisoners hiding in rubble. What they found instead was a settlement of nearly 80 souls. Defended by Bram's disciplined militia across terrain the enforcers did not understand, and Tamlin's people knew intimately. Every collapsed passage and hidden chamber turned to tactical advantage against soldiers trained for open combat rather than a labyrinth of ancient, crystal-lit streets. The first clash came at dusk on the outer district's main thoroughfare. Where Bram had positioned archers along elevated walkways, Perrin had spent a full day reinforcing with scavenged timber. And the Silent Blades, advancing in the tight, disciplined formation their training demanded, walked directly into a crossfire that dropped 4 of their number before the rest even understood where the arrows originated. The enforcer's captain, a hard-eyed woman named Thren, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency Cassian Vey had specifically requested for this mission, adapted quickly, splitting her remaining force into smaller hunting parties to root out the ambush points one by one rather than continuing to advance as a single vulnerable column. The fighting stretched across 3 brutal days, fought not in open battle, but in a grinding series of ambushes and retreats through the city's winding districts, and it cost Tamlin's people dearly despite their tactical advantage. Mother Yu died on the 2nd day, caught while tending wounded too close to a collapsing passage that Bram's forces had deliberately triggered to trap a company of pursuing enforcers. A sacrifice that saved perhaps a dozen lives at the cost of the woman who had saved dozens more over the preceding years. Tamlin knelt beside her body in the crystal-lit dark for a long time before duty forced him back to the desperate work of coordinating the city's defense, carrying her loss alongside every other decision he made in the hours that followed. By the second night, Thren's hunting parties had pushed deep enough into the settlement's residential quarter that Tamlin himself, sword in hand for the first time since his own trial, fought alongside Bram's militia in close, brutal combat through narrow stone corridors never designed to hold this much violence. He killed a man that night, an enforcer who very nearly ran Sarah through from behind, while she worked to evacuate a group of frightened children toward the deeper, unexplored districts. And he felt, driving his salvage blade home, none of the horror he might once have expected of the mild-mannered royal architect he used to be, only the same cold, exhausted clarity that had carried him through 9 days of digging through solid stone with his bare hands. Perrin fell on the third day, and the fighting Tamlin would remember most vividly for the rest of his life, a desperate last stand at the passage connecting the outer districts to the city's deep central plaza, where Perrin, wounded already and unable to retreat further, held the narrow choke point alone against 3 enforcers long enough for Bram's reinforcements to arrive and finish what he had started. Tamlin reached him only after the enforcers had been driven back, kneeling in the same dark passage where Perrin had once tumbled through a broken wall 11 days into his own live burial, and heard, in the locksmith's final labored words, no regret at all, only quiet satisfaction that the debt he had always insisted he owed had in the end been paid in full. The surviving Silent Blades, having lost more than half their company against a defense they had never anticipated, withdrew from the city on the 4th morning, carrying word of a failure Tamlin understood, with grim certainty, that Cassian Vey would neither easily accept nor easily explain away to a crown that had never authorized this expedition in the first place. Tamlin's people buried their own dead in the city's central plaza, beneath the false crystal sky Perrin had once helped him fully understand, and Tamlin spoke at both gravesides himself, plainly, without the practiced eloquence his old court life had once trained into him. Because his people did not need beautiful words. They needed honesty. And the honest truth was that the city they had built together, however precious, would always demand a price from those who chose to defend it. In the 2 years that followed that costly, hard-won victory, Tamlin's settlement transformed from a fragile, hidden community into something the surviving underworld traders along the Barrow's edges had quietly begun calling Alindra Reborn a functioning city in its own right. Populated now by nearly 200 souls, most of them former Hollow prisoners rescued through Tamlin's deliberately expanded network of surface contacts, trading in crystal light technology and ancient craftsmanship that no surface kingdom's finest artisans could replicate. Sarah, matured now from the frightened, furious girl who had once tumbled through a crumbling wall, ran the settlement's growing trade network with a shrewdness that made even Orenthal, still their most trusted surface contact, treat her negotiations with genuine wariness. Bram trained a proper standing defense force, drilling new arrivals in the specific tactics that had won the city its costly victory against the Silent Blades, incorporating lessons learned from every ambush and every mistake into a discipline considerably more sophisticated than the desperate improvisation that had first saved them. And Corwin Ash, given years to earn back a trust he had once badly damaged, had become, through slow and deliberate effort, one of the settlement's most reliable hands. It was Corwin, in fact, who first suggested establishing a second, entirely separate surface contact independent of Orenthal's network. A piece of cautious, forward-thinking strategy that Tamlin recognized with quiet satisfaction as exactly the kind of contribution a man once driven by pure self-interest could offer once he had genuinely come to see the settlement's survival as his own. The city itself had changed as much as its people. Districts that had stood dark and silent for 3 centuries now hummed with the quiet activity of forges and workshops. Crystal light lanterns strung along streets where once only Tamlin's own frightened footsteps had echoed. Children born within the settlement's walls, 3 of them, by the close of that second year. The first new lives Alindra had witnessed since its empire's fall grew up believing the crystal-lit sky above their heads was simply how the world looked, a fact that struck Tamlin. Whenever he considered it, as the strangest and most hopeful transformation of all. Tamlin himself had changed in ways that extended well beyond the scars, mapping his ruined, rebuilt hands. He stood now at the threshold of the city's central plaza on the evening, marking the 9th anniversary of his live burial, looking out over lantern-lit towers and bridges that Halvard Koss, dying alone and undiscovered 40 years earlier, had never lived to see populated again. And he thought, as he often did on such quiet evenings, of Cassian Vey's carefully rehearsed sorrow in that long-ago throne room, of King Alaric's exhausted willingness to believe whatever story let him sleep at night, of the particular arithmetic of a crown that had decided a competent, loyal architect's usefulness mattered less than a jealous rival's ambition. He thought, too, of the deep, unlit districts at the city's furthest edge, the ones that had unsettled him from his very first cautious exploration, and of the reports his scouts had begun bringing him in recent months, faint sounds, deep in that unexplored dark, that Bram's most experienced soldiers swore had not existed a year earlier, and a subtle brightening in the ambient crystal light throughout the entire city, gradual and nearly imperceptible except to a man who, like Tamlin, had spent 9 years learning to notice every smallest change in this ancient place's strange, half-understood nature. He did not yet know what stirred in that unexplored dark, whether it represented some final deeper danger or some deeper truth about the empire that had built this impossible city and then vanished so thoroughly from every surface record. He knew only that whatever it was waking, slowly, alongside the city itself, and that Halvard Koss, dying alone decades earlier, had sensed the same thing and never lived long enough to learn what it meant. Sarah found him there at the plaza's edge, as the crystal-lit evening deepened toward the city's manufactured night, climbing the worn stone steps with the easy confidence of a woman who had long since stopped being the frightened girl who once tumbled through a broken wall, and stood beside him in comfortable silence for a long while, before finally telling him what her surface contacts had confirmed only that morning. Vey couldn't explain the losses, she said, not to a king who never authorized the expedition in the first place. So now he's raising a real force, dressed up as border security, moving slow enough that no one asks the wrong questions. My contact says 300 men, maybe more. Cavalry, siege equipment. If the rumors about the wagon trains are true. He knows then, Tamlin said. Not rumors anymore. He knows I'm alive, and he knows what's down here. He knows enough to be afraid of it. Sarah said. That's worse for him. A frightened man with an army is the most dangerous thing in the world. She glanced sideways at him, the sharp, evaluating look she had never quite lost from her years surviving on the streets before the Barrows. Are we ready? Tamlin considered this news for a long moment, watching lantern light flicker across towers his own hands had helped restore, and felt the same cold, patient certainty settle over him that had carried him through 9 years of impossible survival, the understanding that a debt deferred was not a debt forgiven, and that the crown which had buried him alive to erase an inconvenient truth was about to discover exactly how thoroughly that truth had refused to stay buried. We held against Thren's silent blades with 80 souls and half a militia, he said finally. We have 200 now, and Bram's had 2 years to turn them into something considerably harder to kill. We are as ready as any city built by discarded men and buried women can be. He paused, watching a distant, unlit district at the very edge of the cavern's reach, where the faint sounds his scouts had begun reporting still occasionally carried on the still underground air. Whether we're ready for whatever's waking down there as well, that I cannot promise you. Somewhere in the unexplored dark at the city's furthest edge, something ancient continued to stir. Patient and unhurried, indifferent to the small, stubborn, human city that had grown up around it and yet, in some way Tamlin could not fully explain even to Sarah. Not entirely indifferent either. And somewhere above the ground, in a capital that had spent 3 centuries insisting Alindra no longer existed, a chancellor's growing army prepared to march on a city that history had promised them was nothing more than rubble and myth. The empire beneath the earth was not yet finished. It was, on that evening, still only a hidden city rebuilding itself from centuries of abandonment. A fragile community of the crowns discarded and forgotten, and an ancient mystery still stirring somewhere in the dark that even its own ruler could not fully name. But Tamlin Rourke stood at the threshold between the world he had rebuilt and the deeper truth still waiting beneath it with the particular stillness of a man who understood, at last, exactly what he had become, no longer simply a survivor of the crown's cruelty, but the keeper of something the crown had spent 300 years desperately hoping the world would forget. And when Cassian Vey's army finally reached the Barrows, they would learn, far too late, that the city they had been told did not exist was no longer merely surviving. It was ready for them.